This is the Bookwaves, Artwaves Hour. Interviews with writers on KPFA's nationally syndicated Bookwaves program, along with interviews about film and theater and archive book interviews that stretch back 4 decades. I'm your host, Richard Wolinsky. We start today's program with a 1991 interview with the great mystery author Sara Paretsky, who, as of now, has written 22 books in the V.I. Warshawski series. This is one of the Sisters in Crime interviews recorded for Probabilities in the 1980s and 1990s, which are slowly being digitized and re-edited. Most of these interviews have not been heard in the new century. That's followed by a 1987 interview with science fiction and horror writer Ian Watson, who died this past April at the age of 82. The show concludes with a review of the world premiere play, The Employee Dharma Handbook by Geetha Reddy, which plays at TheaterWorks in Palo Alto through August 2nd. As usual, you can find updated links and listings to bookstore and live theater venues by clicking on the link at the top of today's Bookwaves Artwaves page at kpfa.org. You can also find a link to the same list by going to the Bay Area Theater podcast page, also at kpfa.org, where you can read and hear the latest theater reviews. Sara Paretsky is the author of the V.I. Warshawski series of mystery novels. This archive interview was recorded for the Probabilities radio show in the KPFA studios on March 18, 1991, while she was in the Bay Area for a mystery conference. At the time, 6 Warshawski mysteries had been published and a 7th had been written, and a couple of months after the interview, a film starring Kathleen Turner was released. As of 2026, there are now 22 novels in the series, 2 standalone novels, 3 short story collections, and 2 works of fiction. While there has been talk of further Warshawski adaptations, none have come to pass. My co-host for the interview was the late Richard A. Lupoff, and this interview was only recently digitized and has not been heard in over 30 years.
V.I. Warshawski is the most hard-boiled of the female detectives. What brought you to write her and create her?
V.I. came from a couple of different places. The first was I was working as a marketing manager for a large multinational insurance company back in the late 70s and really through the 80s to the late 80s. And when you are a woman in management, and especially at that period, we were really the pioneers in management. There was support for us, to be sure, but there was also a lot of pressure just to see how far we could be pushed before we would crack. In fact, one of the women in the company who was promoted to a very senior level of management, my boss came to me and said he had a bet with some of the guys on when he would be able to make her cry in public. So a lot of us were taking that kind of heat, and really V.I. came to me one day in a meeting. I was sitting there, my lips were saying, "Gosh, Fred," my boss, "what an idea." And the balloon over my head was saying, "You expletive." And suddenly I thought, V.I., a woman who's doing a job that didn't exist for women when we started high school, a woman taking those kinds of pressures, but someone who could say what was in the balloon over her head.
Had you done any mystery writing before that?
No, I had really been writing very privately my whole life. I had never tried to write for publication, and really until I got into my 30s, it didn't occur to me that I might write for publication. When I wrote the first book, of course, when you write a book, you have a fantasy that it will be published. I specifically wanted to do something with a woman private eye because as a lifelong mystery reader, you start noticing the way that women have traditionally been depicted in private eye novels. And, Chandler is the classical example. If a woman is sexually active, she's evil. And so I had wanted to have a character, write a book, try to in some way turn the tables on that, establish a different image, all those kinds of things.
At that time, were any of the current women writers writing like
Linda Barnes, Marcia Muller, Julie Smith, McNair, Marilyn Wallace.
Marcia Muller has published her first book with Sharon McCone in 1977. I have to confess that I didn't actually read it, or it didn't come to my attention until I was well launched on Indemnity Only. There were a few people doing rather isolated things. To me, in some ways, Marcia was the first, although there were Carolyn Heilbrunn with Amanda Cross had been around for quite a while, but was not a private investigator in the real sense of the word.
Now, VI has an interesting history. Her father was a cop, and her mother was an immigrant Jewish from Italy. She has an alcoholic aunt, a nasty uncle who lives far away. Where is that in?
He's in Kansas City, actually.
Which is where you're from?
Near there, yeah.
Was that deliberate?
Well, I keep thinking that I might want to go set some crime in the old Kansas countryside, and so it was handy to put a relative down there.
And she lives in a walk-up that has in the basement floor an elderly man with his dog. Now, is that dog similar to the dog you own?
Yes, it's similar to the dog that I own, but much better behaved. I mean, someone really trained that dog, unlike the people who own the dog I own.
V.I. Warshawski, first of all, what does the V.I. mean, and what does she like to be called?
When I started with her, I wanted to give her what seemed to me to be a Polish last name, and even though my own last name is Polish, I'm very bad on the ethnic origins of names. So I thought, okay, Warsaw, that's in Poland. Warshawski, that's got to be Polish. Although, in fact, a snot at the University of Chicago Slavics department came to me at a party one night and said, well, you know, you've come up with a last name of no definable place of national origin. I said, it's Polish. And he said, well, not the way you've spelled it. But anyway, it's Polish. So that's life at the University of Chicago.
You do love academics.
And somehow the initials just seemed to go with it when I had the last name. And that's why I always think of her as V.I., because I wrote about her for several months before I came up with the names. But the names are Victoria Iphigenia, and I made a list of all the names I could think of that began with V, and of course Victoria with its implications of victory and power and those kinds of things seemed appropriate. But then, because I had given her an Italian mother who had trained to sing opera, she was named Victoria for Victor Emmanuel II, not the third, not the fascist collaborator, but his father. And then Iphigenia. I'm a little tired of it, but it's something that I'm sort of stuck with the character. But to her, at least at the time that I was writing it, Vicky seemed like a kind of a patronizing thing to be called.
She has this large family. She also has
a cousin Boom Boom, I think, right. Definitely needs a little thought.
Boom Boom, the hockey player. This is somewhat different from the other private eyes who seem not to have their family all over them all the time. Did this just come out, or was it something new that you thought of?
I can't say that I thought of doing it. I didn't sit down to write for a market or to make things that seemed to be distinctive. I actually, because when I started writing, I was very nervous and uncertain about whether I could execute. I tried following as many conventions of the form as I could, and in the form, the private eye is always an orphan, a loner, all these things. It's not a style that I'm personally comfortable with, and as time has gone by, it's just become I somehow can't seem to write well about her unless I'm writing about her in the context of her personal life. And I think one of the problems, I'm having a terrible time with the book that I'm working on now, the worst time that I've had actually with any of the books that I've written. And I've written 100,000 words and the end isn't in sight and I'm going crazy. But I was realizing the other day that I think one of the real problems I have with it is that it isn't personally grounded the way the last 4 books have been.
The most recent Burn Marks, I thought, is it pronounced Elena?
Uh-huh.
I thought that she was the most wonderful character for all of the unconventionalities, to say the least. She's a mess, okay? But she has a wonderful charm to her, or am I just putting something there that's not there?
Well, she isn't supposed to be, I mean, she is in some ways god-awful, but but she is supposed to be likable. Well, actually, years ago, I worked for a small company that we clipped newspaper articles on issues of we thought were socially important, and then we did publications based on all these articles. And 20 years ago, I read this story about a retirement hotel in Minneapolis where old circus performers all live, and where there were two women who would relieve the guys of their pension checks once a month, and women in their 60s, and I guess one was late 60s and one was in her 70s, and they were essentially turning tricks like Elena does. And they just seemed like people who were having a good time. They all liked living together, and so that was in my mind when I thought of Elena. I guess more charm than hideousness.
Speaking of burn marks, since it is the most recent Warshawski novel until the new one is completed, of course, she becomes involved with just the most god-awful mess of crooked politicians, crooked real estate people. There is some implication of an insurance scam there, and I'm sure because of your experience in the insurance industry, you know whereof you write. Is Chicago really that bad?
Chicago is not as bad as it was before there's a federal decision called the Shackman decision, which affected patronage hiring in the city. Now that the city politicians don't have so many jobs to hand out, the level of corruption is lower than it used to be. On the other hand, the county still has enormous amounts of patronage, the county in which Chicago sits, patronage jobs, and the real political power now is with the county politicians, which is why it's set with that connection. But yes, I think that there's a tremendous amount of corruption in the city and the county, and the prime basis of it is in contracting, the construction industry, and all the ways that comes together. And see, what politicians have to sell is zoning permits, and what contractors. And so contractors fund the campaigns, and then they get the early running on projects and where it might be possible to build. And it doesn't have to be public money that's being spent. It just has to be that here's land that might be available to build on.
The problem of the fraudulent minority-owned firms
is a serious problem, although there are many good minority-owned firms, but I guess the most notorious is the one involving Noah Robinson, Jesse Jackson's half-brother, who, well, he's under all kinds of indictments right now, but who boasted on the contracts that he got for a new state of Illinois building that I don't think he had any employees and that he had never set foot in the place. And he just fronted for some white contractors.
On our way down here to the station today, we were talking about people's feelings about the government, lack of confidence in the government as a sort of different generational experience that people of different ages have had. And while we are taping this interview, it's just the week of the L.A. police beating that was captured by an amateur videotape. Do you feel that it's all falling apart, or what's going on?
I really think the lesson of the last 25 years has been that when people organize locally, that they can take some control over their lives and that they can exert some power. And that when they don't, they're terribly fragmented and terribly abused. When I first moved to Chicago, I was working in a community service program on the city's southwest side, which was an area of the city that, blue-collar, little bungalows, people who came out 90-1 for Richard Daley, and they had nothing that the city wanted except their votes. They were just reamed by a connection of banks and real estate companies and the racism of the city government. I don't know, it was a heartbreaking introduction to the city, and I think it's permanently colored my view of the city. And I keep thinking, if only they would have been able to form a block club or even just one small thing where they could get together and not be individually taken advantage of as they were, things would have been different. I just think that I don't think governments operate out of conspiracies or anything like that. I think you just get big organizations that take on a life of their own and mow over what's in their paths.
Both burn marks and bloodshot deal with corruption. Bloodshot deals with the corruption involved in, I guess, industrial disease and trying to cover it up. V.I. Warshawski is herself a feminist. How do you see your books in a political sense? Do you think that the fact that you're using corruption and industrial, I guess, felonies as a backdrop is simply because that's what the backdrop of detective novels, or do you think there's something else going on? Do you have I don't want to say an ulterior motive, but do you have another point?
When I started writing the first book, I was working then in the insurance industry, and I set it in insurance because it was something that I knew about, and I wanted to make the job as easy on myself as I could. Stuart Kaminsky, who gave me tremendous advice and support through the first book, suggested that I continue with white-collar crime as a way to have something to hang, if it turned into a published series, hang it on. But I've found that over time that, I guess as I get older, in some ways I get angry or certainly somewhat more passionate about some of these issues. And I look at the city and I think of all the energy, or look at the country as a whole for that matter, that we put into searching for, arresting, prosecuting, and convicting nickel and dime drug dealers, or in the case of murder, someone who may be committing a gang murder in the inner city. And I do not want to belittle that at all. I mean, if you murder someone, it's great grief to that person's family, and I don't want to say that it's a trivial crime. But I do believe that tremendous damage is done by large institutions that we don't take nearly as seriously. For example, a couple of years ago, just right now, what we have going on with Charles Keating, the banks and the savings and loan, one of Keating's little marketing tricks was to take elderly depositors and to target market them, get them to sell their federally insured CDs and to buy junk bonds in the companies that Drexel was floating. Now that those banks have gone bust, and now that the companies have gone bust and aren't paying on the paper, we don't know how many of those old people have starved to death, how many of them are out of their homes, how many of them have had to turn to robbery to support themselves. And, this man could have killed hundreds of people that he'll never be held accountable for. And I guess as time has gone by, I've started feeling more and more passionate about those kinds of issues. And so my books in some way have started to be maybe more doctrinaire, I don't know, in trying to show what happens when big institutions do flex their muscles in these ways.
You're listening to a Probabilities archive interview with Sara Paretsky, author of the V.I. Warshawski Mystery Series, who was recorded March 16, 1991 in the KPFA studios. My co-host was Richard A. Lupoff. I'm Richard Wolinsky on the Bookwaves, Artwaves Hour.
What about Warshawski's feminism? Do you see that getting stronger? How do you see that in the mix?
Warshawski's certainly a feminist as an aspect of her character, but I don't see, I guess I see it more as evidenced in how the choices that she makes and how she lives her life, more than specific issues that she tackles or doesn't tackle, or things that she says or how she does them. I've been at a conference at Berkeley today on women in the mystery, and one of the things that has come up is, why don't some of these women have more lovers and more sex in their lives? And I've been thinking about this lately with VI, and I came to this sort of unpleasant conclusion that I'm so involved with her life that I can't, that I don't have the graciousness to let her have a private life with someone else. So I'm trying in the book that I'm working on to loosen up and give her the same pleasures that I might like to have.
But do you feel that private eyes, detectives in general, and especially female, or is there a distinction between the males and females? There seems to be a strangely puritanical thread running through the mystery field. For all we have, especially on the old paperback, sleazy covers with women with dresses cut to their navels. But when you actually read the book, there's a kind of puritanism there, or is there?
That's a curious point. think in some ways the way that The Private Eye was conceived by Chandler was very much in the kind of the mythic mold of the old Western cowboy, someone like the Virginian, and that person does remain rather aloof from the people around them. One of the problems with writing a series character is that the person that is most intimate with the detective is the reader. And when you bring a lover into the books, you're really distracting from that primary relationship. And it's a difficult problem to resolve. I mean, some people love Susan Silverman, for example, with Spencer, but I don't. I feel like it's really pulled the books off center.
Well, what about a character like, I think Carrie of the Nameless Detective, or Kinsey Milhone's boyfriend? I mean, what about those?
I haven't read Sue's most recent book, so I didn't know that Kinsey had a steady boyfriend. She did have an involvement,
right,
actually, with a psychopath who turned out to try to kill her, which was a rather curious episode and must have been rather difficult to think about and write. The other thing is that you want the character to have a reason for being in the book, because the resolution of the crime story is, after all, the resolution of the crime, not the resolution of the romance.
I'm sure you're familiar with a book called Silk Stockings, When Women Write of Murder by Victoria Nichols and Susan Thompson. They take a pretty hard shot at VI. They say, for instance, unfortunately, Warshawski, in her anger and her aggressive pugnacity, is one of the least attractive heroes we've recently encountered. She may have a sense of justice, but it seems self-serving at best. And they go on, but I will not. That's pretty rough stuff.
You always feel hurt when someone has negative things to say about you. I guess that's inevitable. But it's good also to step back and try to think about it. When I get negative criticism, I do try to think whether it's something that I ought to be working to change. But in general, I think you have to think about how we think as a society about what women should be like and what men should be like, gender roles, and specifically what it means to be feminine or to be masculine. And I think that there is a group of people, men and women, who fear that any time a woman seems to be stepping out of certain rather narrowly defined ways of behaving, that she suddenly become masculine rather than becoming just a different kind of woman. She's no longer a woman at all. She's someone suffering from that terrible disease of penis envy who hasn't got it under control. And I have to confess that I did tend to have that reaction to that kind of comment.
Would you say that Warshawski then is no more abrasive in her own way, let's say, than a Marlowe?
Yeah, I mean, VI is abrasive in her own way, and I would say that she's more abrasive than many people. But you see, I'm more abrasive than many people, and I think of myself as a feminine kind of woman, perhaps erroneously, but sometimes I say things that I wish I hadn't, that are just too mean or hard or hurtful, but I don't, that makes me an unpleasant person, not an unwomanly woman.
How much like you do you think is VI?
Well, VI unfortunately has to share my political values. Poor thing, she doesn't have a voice of her own. What VI really represents to me are the changes that many women in America have been struggling with over the past 20 years. Not so much my own, but trying to find a balance between the personal, the political, and the professional, and not always succeeding in balancing it well.
One other question about VI, which came to me from a big fan of yours. She said, I love VI, but why do you always have her beaten up, tortured, banged up, scrunched up, and left for dead in virtually every book?
You have to tell your friend that that's a question that comes so deep out of my unconscious that I haven't got a good flip answer. To be probably more honest than is necessary or helpful to anyone, I have to think that really I'm a rather angry person, and that a lot of the violence in my books is a kind of a metaphor or an expression of that. VI gets beaten up more because I often feel mentally pummeled, and that's probably a concretization of how, at least I've often historically felt. And then she has to be able to right herself and go on and make it work and show that she can't be destroyed. And a person who was either a better integrated person emotionally or had a less violent upbringing or, some combination of those things, a better person than I would write less violently, perhaps.
Did you have a particularly violent upbringing?
Yes, I think that I did, actually. There was a lot of both physical and verbal violence in the household that I grew up in.
And do you have a relationship with your family now?
Yeah, I do. I'm the only female in a large family. I have 4 brothers, and I'm kind of the Grand Central Station. Everybody communicates through me, which is I think, something that perhaps one ought not to allow, but it happens.
To contrast or to compare the real Sara Paretsky and the fictitious V.I. Warshawski, it seems to me that she's the fulcrum of a large and contentious family also. And we've already mentioned her Aunt Elena, her cousin Boom Boom, Aunt Rosa, cousin Albert. Who have left out?
Of the family?
Well, anyway.
Well, there are lots that you don't
uncle in Kansas
Uncle
City.
Peter, and he has children, and one of them, Petra, has just run away from home to take part in anti-war activities in Chicago. Nobody knows about that yet except me, and now you two.
Would you say then that this a reflection of the real Sara Paretsky's life?
Oh, probably inevitably it is, but I wouldn't want to push at it too far. I think, as I was saying earlier, that what seems to work for me writing about VI is to be able to set a personal context, and that's why these relatives keep popping up.
She has inputs from non-family members, some of whom she selected and others of whom she's sort of stuck with. I'm thinking specifically of the contrast between Letty Herschel on the one hand and Bobby Mallory on the other.
Mr. Contreras.
Yeah. Writers talk about things writing themselves, and I always think it's a sort of just a peculiar, not very credible kind of concept. But Lottie is someone who I brought into the first book. She's a doctor, and VI needed a doctor. And she was to be a walk-on, walk-off character who showed up like Doc Vollmer in the Rex Stout books when a doctor was needed, and just ended up becoming a major character. And I think probably in some ways works for VI as some older women have worked for me in establishing a sense of community, of a place of refuge. And then as I've become older and stronger, I've become able to be giving back and not just taking. And these relationships are among the most important in my life, and I suppose that Lottie really reflects that. With Bobby Mallory, the problem with Bobby is that, I was very much following the stereotype of the private eye novel with friction between the police and the PI, and inevitably, I think, even in reality, there is or there would be. To me, he became an awfully stereotypical figure, and in Burn Marks, I felt that I had to resolve that relationship. And really, he's not going to be in future books. The book that I'm writing now, he doesn't even appear. He's only referred to every now and then as the lieutenant by some of the younger officers. Some of the friction continues, but there are other dimensions. In fact, VI is having an affair in the current book with one of the police officers, Conrad Rawlings, who made his first appearance in Bitter Medicine.
What about Mr. Contreras?
I don't know. Mr. Contreras is another character who came out of nowhere. I think that when you are a strong woman, or a woman who's trying to maybe is a little more abrasive or has some of these more strident qualities, that a lot of times you find that significantly older men are very attracted to you. That in some ways they're safe relationships because they won't cross a sexual line. And so you get this kind of thing which can be supportive and also rather bizarre at the same time. And he seems to fulfill that role for her.
You've been listening to a Probabilities archive interview with Sara Paretsky, author of the V.I. Warshawski series of mysteries, recorded March 16, 1991 in the KPFA studios. My co-host was Richard A. Lupoff. I'm Richard Wolinsky on the Bookwaves, Artwaves Hour. We'll be right back. Ian Watson, who died on April 13, 2026 at the age of 82, was an unconventional science fiction writer whose works brimmed with originality and humor. Author of over 31 novels, not including several written in the world created by the Warhammer 40,000 game, there were also 11 collections of short stories, plus a catalog of poems. An avowed socialist, he also stood in elections as a Labour Party candidate in the days before Tony Blair. On July 1, 1987, Ian Watson was in Oakland for the 40th annual WesterCon Science Fiction Convention, and it was there that Richard A. Lupoff and I interviewed him for our Probabilities radio show on KPFA.
How did you get involved in writing science fiction?
Well, originally, I wanted to be a writer. This was a sort of diffuse ambition that I had since a fairly early age. So I went off and studied English literature. I was going to be a scientist originally, but I completely messed up my practical exams in chemistry by swallowing a lot of methylated spirits in one of those experiments you do. And I thought, this is not for me. I'll, go the path of imagining it.
I'm sorry. What do methylated spirits do to you?
Just make you sick, really. I mean, there's many more interesting things than that. Well, a lot of people drink methylated spirits if they, can't afford whiskey, and you will see people drinking meths around on the streets in London, nowadays under our tyrannical conservative government. But it didn't do anything for me at the time, apart from slightly turn me off applied science. So anyway, I went the path of literature and did a literature degree at Oxford, and I thought I was, going to be a writer, but what the hell was I going to write about? There's a story about Oscar Wilde, who also had an ambition to be an author, and he went to Oxford too. And his aunt asked him one day, what are you going to be when you grow up, Oscar? And he said, I'm going to be a writer. And his aunt said, what are you going to write, Oscar? And he looked at her piercingly and said, my dear aunt, one doesn't write about things, one just writes. And I guess I was a bit like that, because I had this burgeoning ambition, but, nothing whatever to express. And the way I got into science fiction was, first of all, when I left Oxford, I went off to East Africa, to Tanzania, to teach literature in the university there. And this was...
When was this?
Yeah, this was in, a long, long time ago. Yes, 1963. I'm actually a sort of grand old man of science fiction, very old. It's just the rejuvenation therapy I take every now and then, which makes me look like this. I collided for the first time with political reality and with the third world and with alternative cultures, which have played quite a big part in my books. I didn't really get switched on to writing science fiction itself, though, till my next job, which was teaching in universities in the center of Tokyo. And Tokyo, at the time I was there in the late 60s, seemed to me to be the future, both the fun aspects of the future, the electronics, and also all of the ecological horror aspects. And the air was so bad when we were there that we were having to sleep in respirators, and the whole city was shaking with earthquakes, and they were putting up higher and higher buildings. It was, and so overpopulated too. The crowding, I mean, you get on a subway train and they've got these people employed to push you in. When you're like sardines in a can, really, as the train picks up speed, you get lifted off your feet, and your arms are pinned by your side. And as the train slows, you get put back on your feet again. Little things like this induced what Alvin Toffler called future shock, and I really started writing science fiction as a kind of psychological survival mechanism to stay sane in this environment, because you couldn't really stay sane just reading Jane Austen and teaching Jane Austen in the midst of all this: poison gas clouds, overpopulation, eco-catastrophe.
You did not have a background reading science fiction, as most writers in the field seem to.
Yeah, well, I had a schizophrenic one. A lot of British kids got turned on to science fiction imagery by a comic which appeared in about 1951 called The Eagle, featuring Dan Dare, pilot of the future. And so, I mean, this presented the imagery of the things that I still hold dear in my secret heart, such as the green trees that live on Venus, and the flame belts of that planet, and the sort of writhing protoplasmic masses. When I was at Oxford, I'd be reading the good literature with one hand, the Shakespeare and Jane Austen, and with the other hand, I'd be schizophrenically clutching Van Vogt and devouring him. It was only really when I got to Tokyo that I was able to integrate these two halves out of dire necessity. And so that's how I really got into writing science fiction. The other current really that flowed into it was when I got back to Britain, I gave up this business of teaching literature and got a job teaching futures studies, futurology, which was a good excuse at the time to teach science fiction and read it and write it. Can't do that now in Britain because the tyrannical conservative government is cutting down fiercely upon funding for universities. So they cut out all fun peripherals whereby would-be writers are able to muck around in art schools and what have you. But anyway, in the particular art school that I mucked around in teaching futurology, I came into collision with psychologists, social anthropologists, and this tied up with my experience of the third world to give me a sort of structure for thinking and writing about alternative kinds of life. And I always think that you can't really write about aliens if you can't come to terms with the alternative cultures which exist and have existed on our own planet.
That makes a lot of sense.
It does make a lot of sense, and it's something that I think a lot of science fiction writers are beginning to realize today that we just didn't think of 20 years ago, and certainly not our forerunners 40 years ago. They just didn't conceive of this. But I also was struck by something you said about Dan Dare and the green threens, were they? Green trees.
They were ruled by the Mekon, who had an extremely small body, which was encased in, well, almost a sort of shrunken diaper, and his head was very, very large, at least the size of his body. Consequently, he had to float around on a little anti-gravity platform. And all of his warriors, his mighty Treen warriors, wore bands of golden brass around their bodies, around their legs and midriffs, and sort of white T-shirts on top, which was a very sort of sexy power image, though I'm not really into power imagery and politically oppose it as much as possible.
What you really are bringing up here is that I'm starting to think that a lot of what we sometimes call science fiction is not really by any reasonable analytical definition of science fiction that at all, but it's just a sort of manipulation of glamorous fantasies, colorful glamorous fantasies, which to say this is not to put it down because it's still wonderful, exciting, and enjoyable. I don't know that science fiction is really a very good name for that kind of stuff.
Well, maybe not, because, it gets more complicated, because the hard science fiction books, the technological nuts and bolts physicist books, so many of them will involve faster-than-light travel, for example, as a way of getting to your star system where the action occurs. Inevitably, it would be boring if the first 4,000 pages of the book described the 200-year journey in a tin can to get there. But, of course, as far as we know scientifically, faster-than-light travel is totally impossible and ruled out. Thus, a science fiction, hardcore science fiction novel which invokes faster-than-light travel or a lot of the other gizmo technology is in fact a sheer fantasy that bears no relationship to science, whereas a book set on a distant planet with fire-breathing dragons, so long as their biology is okay, is actually science because it's reasonable, possible, and practical. So, many fantasies are actually plausible scientifically, and a lot of hardcore science fiction is no science at all. What I would say that science fiction does is that it's a way whereby we create metaphors that express our own contemporary anxieties about the future and desires about the future. It is metaphorical imagery.
When you got started, what was the first book that you wrote, and was there a particular point? Was that the book that you kind of purged yourself of in Tokyo?
No, because I don't really write autobiography very much. The first science fiction book that I wrote was called The Embedding, and that appeared when I came back to Britain. The actual first book that I wrote was a biography of my cat that I did for a Japanese educational publisher, and this contained 70 pages of simple English plus 70 pages of notes in Japanese because we flew our large pussycat out to Tokyo. And there's a classic of the Meiji era in Japan when industrialization was first hitting the country called I Am a Cat, in which a Japanese cat of the 1890s observes the social and technological changes around about it. So I updated that for the Japanese school kids. And it went on selling for about 10 years. But anyway, you're not interested in that. Science fiction. The first science fiction novel that I produced was a thing called The Embedding, which was a book about linguistics, psycholinguistics, soft science. And nobody had really, with one or two slight exceptions, Jack Vance, for instance, though he wasn't heavily going into the linguistics.
Languages of Power?
Languages of Power, yeah, but that's based upon the outmoded Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, cultural of linguistic relativism. Yeah, I went into the in thing, the cutting edge of Chomskyan psycholinguistics, right, and about deep semantic structures and universal grammar. And that hadn't quite been done before. So the book, for that reason, I think possibly made a little bit of a wave. I was quite surprised at that. In fact, the French gave me an award for it and invited me over there.
What year was that?
Oh, that was in 1973.
You sat down and you wrote this book.
Yeah.
Not counting the biography of the cat, which is a very special situation. Here you are, an unknown author, walking up to this publishing industry, which, as we all know, is extremely inbred and chummy and old school tie oriented. Even among the rebellious people, they get chummy and old school tie among themselves. Here you are as a relative outsider. How did you crack that?
Well, yes, by knowing nothing about it, you see. I still don't have an agent these days, which maybe it may be a mistake, but on the other hand, I've had 3 close encounters, which have boded no good. Well, all I did, actually, I had a few short stories published in New Worlds, which was the speculative fiction magazine. Not because I was part of the New Worlds movement, but more out of a sense of annoyance. If they can write this and pass it over on the public, they can write some of my stuff and publish it too. And they did a little bit of it, but I never really got integrated into the New Worlds movement. In fact, to such an extent that I also wrote my first novel in a sort of white heat of annoyance. I think writers need a sort of element of arrogant belief, that they're going to make it. I also wrote it in a rather linguistically embedded way, so that, I won't go into this at the moment, but large sections of the book were incomprehensible because they were trying to mime impossible and non-logical languages. So anyway, what I did, in Britain, there are not a vast number of science fiction writers, in fact, and there are not many have emerged. It's not like America where 1,000 emerge every 2 years. So there wasn't quite the sort of sense of crush, and that the publishers had just as many writers as they wanted. They had some of the golden oldies, and they were quite anxious to get any new talent. So what Gans, the publisher to whom I sent it, was right back and say, you've got a good story here if you can only write it in reasonably comprehensible prose. So what I did was rewrite the thing out of the embedded language, which would have made it into an experimental novel that might have been admired by 10 people, and rewrote it as a science fiction novel. Well, it was a science fiction novel anyway. It was full of aliens and things like that. But I wrote it in a way that communicated more to the reader, and I think that was that was a good bit of advice. Because probably picking it up nowadays in its original version, I wouldn't understand it either.
You're talking to a man who has an experience with writing in an invented language to a certain extent, and you run into all sorts of problems with it. Of course, I think they're justified in complaining. The author's own experimentation is conducted, I think, for his own purposes, which may be entirely valid, but the reader wants the green trees.
Well, I tend not to be too pretentious in my books. I try not to be too pretentious. They're bad enough already, because I have a rather twisted mind, so that the kind of ideas that turn up in them are already trouble enough, without the prose being trouble at the same time. I try to write as beautifully as I can, but I don't want to write experimentally. Oxford, the place where I went, is a sort of hotbed of pretension, so that I've spent years trying to escape from this kind of pretension, and sort of academic pretension too. I was most pissed off with Charles Platt when he interviewed me and characterized me as an Oxford academic just because I happened to be living there in a rented house at the time, and he had hang-ups about academia, as I had been really trying to shake myself loose from all this kind of thing for years by then.
You're listening to an interview with the late British science fiction author Ian Watson, who died on April 13, 2026, at the age of 82. It was recorded in Oakland, California on July 1st, 1987. My co-host was the late Richard A. Lupoff. I'm Richard Wolinsky on the Bookwaves, Artwaves Hour.
After the embedding, had you intended at that point to continue writing science fiction, or once that book sold, you just kind of said, okay, I'm going to try again with something slightly different?
No, it's the way I think, actually. I'd realized by then that this was the way I thought about things. I mean, I couldn't think about things in terms of consensus reality and sort of a mundane background and life in a rented house in some suburb of London. No, I mean, things flow together. I was interested in consciousness research and altered states of perception and, there's a whole sort of gamut of things, and this screws up your mind so that you start perceiving the world in an altered way. And the only way in which you can really express this, I think, is by some kind of science fictional mode, because there, everything goes. The possibilities are so much more enlarged and spacious, and thereby we might actually perceive a little bit about the universe, which is, after all, stranger than we can possibly comprehend.
Is this where books like, say, Miracle Visitors came from, stuff like that?
Miracle Visitors was a scary book for me because I was getting to a problem about relationship between consciousness and reality, and how the two, how one constructs the other, how they interact, and how, in some respects, consciousness can somehow transform the world. And the UFOs seemed like a good metaphor for this process, because, I mean, supposedly, well, it is my theory of UFOs, which is the right one. I'll tell you why it's the right one, actually, because a French guy called Bertrand Meilleur wrote a book called Science Fiction et Soucoupe Volante simultaneously with me, and he came to exactly the same thesis about UFOs. So, I mean, if two people arrive at the same, viewpoint, then it's incontestably correct. This is called synchronicity,
Right.
It's the way the universe is structured. I mean, if you talk to some of these guys who are on the panels at this convention, like Rudy Rucker, and then, I mean, he will tell you that this is how the universe is mathematically structured. In actual fact, it's not sort of cause and effect. It's chains of fractal networks and synchronicity. So UFOs were a good metaphor for this way in which reality melts and then reforms, because UFOs seem to be a kind of projection of the human consciousness onto objective reality. That is, they are generated by the human psyche, the collective human psyche, yet they produce actual, tangible, physical consequences. I don't necessarily believe in them. I've never seen any, but they were a powerful metaphor for this. The UFO literature was. And nobody'd really written about the UFO literature because that's, infra dig and not quite done in science fiction. Flying saucer people are nuts compared with the science fiction readers who are for the sane and rational. I did have some odd experiences, though, which were rather frightening me. It was a frightening book to write, because if I hadn't resolved the problems of reality that I was dealing with in my head, I would, in that book, and I had not been able to finish it, I felt to have been able to write anything else and move on and do something different. And also, coincidentally, in the local newspapers where I was writing, there were reports of UFO sightings getting closer and closer, 30 miles, 28 miles, as I was writing this. And I realized that they were homing in on me, and if I didn't finish that book in time, then who knows what might have happened.
But since you did, you were saved.
I was, it was okay. We did have a visit from a man in black, which was odd, because this is part of the UFO mythology, too, that these sort of android zombies wearing black suits.
Yes, they're famous, the men in black.
Yeah, well, we had a visit from one. He knocked on the door and asked if he could use our bathroom, which was odd because we were living in a terrace street and there was a big park. There's plenty of trees and bushes, which people often used at the bottom of the street. And down the other way, there were public toilets. And so, I mean, this man in black came in and did something in our house.
There are a couple of your books which I found particularly intriguing that I would like to ask you about. One of them is The Martian Inca, which, for starters, the title is wonderful because you conjure and combine two of these shimmering glamour images, Incas and Martians. Secondly, the title is not a scam on the reader. The book really is about a Martian Inca and what you do with that theme in the book. Rather than my try and dig out very fine specific points, I would just like you to talk a little bit about that book, what you did in it, and why and how you did it.
Well, in that particular book, I, as you say, my brain works by putting together things which don't appear to belong together and creating a sort of truth out of their collision. And I had done this in the previous two books. In this particular one, it was continuing an interest which I had in South America, which I've never visited. But, I mean, again, the principle is if you can't describe countries on your own planet that you haven't visited, well, how can you describe alien worlds? I was interested in the Incas. I mean, who wouldn't be? After all, fascinating people. What I put together was I had this vision of the Inca Empire reborn from the sort of oppressed peasantry in the mountains. And, by what method? Well, I was into a consciousness research, obviously by a sort of exalted leap of consciousness, which would enable people to perceive new connections and somehow control the world and reorganize their lives. So where would I get this from? And I thought of the red planet Mars. Here again, things come together because I conceived of a life form which could exist on Mars. Now, there's a nice little thing on Earth called the slime mold, which is one of these microscopic blobs, and periodically these blobs all decide to congregate and flow together and form little fruiting columns, which are almost macroscopic. You can see them. And it occurred to me that Mars, because of its climate, which possibly there was running water there relatively recently, it goes through climatic oscillations. The atmosphere might outgas every 24,000 years or so. The air pressure might rise, the place might warm up a little bit, and they might, well, okay, how do you have a life form that adapts to having to put up with sort of 24,000 years or something of that order of dormancy? Well, you take it apart and just let the bits lie around as spores. So I thought of a Martian life form based upon the slime mold. And of course, my astronauts who get to Mars get infected by this, and it starts trying to connect up, but it's connecting up inside their bodies, which it has contaminated, and is starting to rewire their perception. And when a space probe bringing back some soil crashes in the high Andes, it contaminates a village, and a lot of people die, but the two main characters get perception rewired. And the Incas were quite into wire, well, not into wire, but into bits of knotted string, as I said, by which they communicated information. So as these people sort of perceive the nature of their own consciousness, the consciousness networks, and as these complexify, one of them, filled with a passionate desire to refound the Inca Empire, he can of course only rewire his consciousness on the basis of what he knew already. So obviously he's doomed because he's setting off to do a dumb thing in the modern world. But it's nevertheless a heroic thing.
What kind of influence, if any, did the some of the works of Colin Wilson? Because I know he dealt with in things like Space Vampires. He dealt with sort of rewiring.
That's a bit later on. Colin Wilson, I mean, I read him when he originally came out with books like Religion and the Rebel and The Outsider, which turned me on to a lot of interesting philosophers. I've always had this problem with the Colin Wilson novels, that when I'm, and the Space Vampires and such, that when I'm reading them, they seem like the most important book ever written in the world. And the next week I can't remember what happened in them. I mean, this doesn't happen with other books. It happens with him. Other books, they sort of fade gradually, or I remember them quite strongly. But only with him do I have this total sense of insight, and then no idea what it was all about the week later.
Have you ever tried rereading that book?
Yes, I think so, and it was like a totally new experience. It was, totally important, and then it just went away again. It went away again, yeah.
I'd like to get on to another book of yours that I think raised just some amazing concepts for first science fiction novel, a book called God's World.
Yeah, well, I mean, that raised too many, obviously, because it never got an American edition. Largely because it was a bit complicated. In many respects, it was my most ambitious novel. So I got somewhat hammered for, writing an ambitious novel like this. The influences on this book, were a lot. There was a lot out of Islamic and Sufi mysticism, by which I was sort of structuring the metaphysical reality of my planet, and quite a bit of shamanism, too. Again, about which I know only what I have researched and imagined. Though people have written and said, gee, I've been living with shamans in the Philippines for the last 6 years, and you know it all. How did you find out? It never hit America. It never looks likely to hit America. It was very popular in France. They invited me over there to do TV shows on French television when it came out. It went for that sort of thing because, well, the French regard science fiction as a high intellectual activity. In Britain, science fiction is regarded as the pits. It's the wrong side of the tracks, and the literary establishment ignores it. In America, I get the sense that there's not actually a literary establishment because it's so small and speaks to so few people that it has no power compared with the sort of massive genre mass marketing. But over in France, science fiction writers are real intellectuals. We are on a par with Jean-Paul Sartre or anyone else, and we're treated like that. Which is very gratifying and possibly a reasonable point of view.
You've been listening to an interview with the late British science fiction author Ian Watson, who died on April 13, 2026, at the age of 82, It was recorded in Oakland on July 1st, 1987. My co-host was the late Richard A. Lupoff. I'm Richard Wolinsky on the Bookwaves, Artwaves Hour. Coming up now, the weekly Bookwaves, Artwaves Theater Review. Discrimination comes at you in many ways: racial bigotry, religious fanaticism, gender and disabled bias, homophobia, fat-shaming, ageism. The list lengthens as you expand to other cultures. There's the whole tribal thing, too. And then there's the caste system from India. Banned in 1950, it still lives on under the surface. Explaining caste in detail takes too long, but some jobs simply can't go to members of one caste or another. The Brahmin are on top, Dalits at the bottom. But has the system spread to America? And if it has, how has it manifested? That question and the relationship of that particular bias to the caste system of corporations lies at the heart of the Employee Dharma Handbook, a new play by Geetha Reddy at TheatreWorks in Palo Alto through August 2nd. The focus is on a handful of workers at a fictional aerospace company. They're building a rocket to Jupiter, and if it all works out, the whole crew will become rich. But Leela, a young Indian scientist born in the United States, has just been passed over by her boss, Krish, for an important promotion that instead went to another Indian, Basu, who himself understands it should have gone to Leela. If this isn't resolved, there is no team. Enter Val, the black HR director, no stranger to bias herself, investigating the matter. Was the problem Leela's gender or something else? Krish is Brahmin, so is Basu. Leela is not. No, says Krish. It's not like that at all, but maybe it is. The Employee Dharma Handbook often doesn't know what kind of play it wants to be. Serious critique, farce, comedy drama. The capitalism and caste dichotomy is unclear, the comedy not as funny as it needs to be. As a world premiere, it needs work, but the elements are there. Each character, at one point or another, becomes facilitator, accuser, victim, winner, and loser. The cast handles the role-switching well, particularly Catherine Smith-McGlynn as Val and Kunal Dudekar as Basu. As the relationships twist and turn, we see a playwright at the top of her game. There comes a point, though, toward the end where the Employee Dharma Handbook goes off the rails, and in order to make a point, the characters become pawns of the playwright. Still, the play is often a thoughtful, funny, and very original ride, with hopefully a bright future. The Employee Dharma Handbook by Geetha Reddy plays at TheatreWorks Lucy Stern Theater in Palo Alto through August 2nd, and for more information you can go to theatreworks.org. Until next week, I'm Richard Wolinsky on the Bookwaves, Artwaves Hour.
Gather around the wireless, folks. We've got exciting news from the world of radio.
Radio Day by the Bay returns to Alameda on Saturday, July 18th. Presented by the California Historical Radio Society, the event features live music, DJs, radio theater, vintage auctions, food, family activities, and free tours of the Radio Central Museum. The day celebrates the history, culture, and continuing impact of radio in the Bay Area and beyond. KPFA will be present, connecting with listeners and community members at the event. Radio Day by the Bay takes place at Radio Central in Alameda and is wheelchair accessible. Additional information is available at chrsradio.org/Radio Day.
Broadcasting from the past, present, and future of radio. We'll see you there.
Let's be honest, there are plenty of subscriptions taking your money and giving you very little back. KPFA is not one of them. The station is here every day, free, bringing you independent news when it matters most. That only happens because listeners step up as monthly sustainers. A guardian of KPFA means your subscription keeps this station free for everyone, including people who cannot afford to give. Right now, one of the kindest things you can do is help somebody stay informed. Become a guardian at kpfa.org.
You can touch that dial if you miss being told what to think. This is 94.1 KPFA, 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, and online everywhere at kpfa.org.